So let us just reflect a little bit on where the growth prospects and growth opportunities may lie. First of all, if we look at the global labor, we are looking at a situation where, due to the COVID crisis, the year 2020, as we reflect upon it, we are looking at a fifth of the global labor in 2030 coming from Africa. Of that, 10 to 15 million new jobs for youth. There will only be 3. There's a requirement. There's 10 to 3 million young people coming out in 2030. And of that, only 3 million new jobs are created. And out of all that, a third of the global youth population is coming out of Africa. So when we look at the very high level of youth unemployment, which can be as high as 90% or more, and the drop in income for the informal sector during this period, it really means that we are faced with economies where employment without legal or social protection is the order of the day, low pay, erratic hours, and uncertain employment status. The youth of today need to be engaged as we start to relook at how we get out of this, if I can say, lockdown economy. How do we get out of the situation that we are in? The youth of today are the custodians they should be the custodians of the pandemic response, so that in future generations, they have the tools with which to respond in terms of pitfalls and challenges that may come their way. And therefore, the imperative for all of us is to look at how we can invest in young people to tackle skills, in particular, skills shortages that could provide a future proof for the recovery and impact of COVID. Job creation and training programs for young people are imperative for us to address the immediate aftermath. And let us remember that when we talk about growth of the economies in Africa, it's not just about how we rebound out of COVID. It is how we entrench the sustainability and how we give our young people the opportunities to build their skills in the workplace as they look at opportunities beyond the continent as well. So what the coronavirus did is that it really exposed our fault lines that meant that some of the careers, the carers in our environments are undervalued. What do we define, or how do we define essential service? Is it essential to me as an individual? Because if I don't trade on that day, my livelihood is directly impacted, or is it essential because it is providing what is deemed to be essential to the economy? So how do we define essential service? This is one of the fault lines and one of the challenges that we on the continent have had to grapple with. The second major challenge has been, how well equipped are we in the productive sectors? How resilient are we as economies? Our manufacturing, our ability to produce, food production, how did we thrive and or survive in the lockdowns? Because it meant that if we can't rely on exports, if we can't rely on services that are coming from outside, how were we equipped to be able to deal with and to respond to the pandemic? So any talk of returning to pre-coronavirus policy settings would ignore the fact that the economy was not working for quite a significant number of our people. We have seen evidence of rising inequality, erosion of social safety nets, and low wage and job growth in many of our economies. And the crisis has really revealed the structural weaknesses of the model of economics that has been prevalent in our respective areas. So let's start looking ahead, acknowledging where we are right now, recognizing the challenges and the impact of the economies and the economics and the policies that we have hitherto addressed or hitherto adopted as a modus of development. How do we go from the narrowly defined economic growth opportunity to making the crucial connections between health and healthy economies? This is the twin challenge of lives versus livelihood that was showcased very strongly. How do we rethink not what and who we value the most, but look at the purpose and the nature and impact of work and worklessness on the kind of society we want to see? We look at women as specifically women workers who have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, creating a risk that is also going to undermine the very modest gender equality that we had made in recent decades. And the work-related gender inequalities will be further exacerbated. The pre-pandemic unequal distribution of unpaid care work has also worsened during this crisis. And we have seen larger economies also buckling under the very same issues that we are flagging and highlighting for the African economy. Looking at the future of work, it is often stated that there will be an unprecedented downturn. If we just wait for the business confidence to come back up to scratch, it's not about to happen anytime soon. A shock of this nature and this scale across so many of our economies and across the world as a whole will require an aggressive government-led and ambitious program to rebuild our economies and put our countries back to work. So the challenge that lies before us as African countries is how do we embark upon detailed industry policy and planning. We will need massive public investment and nation building projects. We will need people to come together to explore ideas for project developments and communities as the bedrock of our development going forward. The emphasis should be on delivering fairer society, creating more jobs, and rising incomes and future growth. Now, all these may sound like pie in the sky, but I believe that if we do not address them, then we are not going to be resilient and effective in our strive to rebuild our economies and, as they normally say, to rebuild better. So the call to action is really for us to interrogate partnerships, leadership, and resources. I believe these are the three areas that we need to focus our energy and our attention on. Let's start with partnerships. Partnerships are partnerships between governments and private sector. The COVID impact is too great a burden for the governments to respond by themselves. They need support from private sector. Private sector government needs to be able to put in place enabling legislation, enabling conditions for the private sector to support and to play their part. We need partnerships with civil society, because civil society have shown in the pandemic that they have a crucial role to play in development in terms of keeping communities together, in terms of looking out for each other in the community, and in terms of knowing where the areas of need are greatest in our communities. And so civil society, particularly at the community level, plays a crucial part and will be an integral partner as we go forth. And finally, the partnership between ourselves as African countries and the developed economies with which we trade. One of those partnerships, for example, is when we look at tourism. Because of the closure of the borders, it means that a lot of our economies have been directly impacted by the inability to get tourism on the ground. This means that we need to find smart ways of maximizing what can be done around tourism, how we define the tourism product, and how we continue to showcase what we have to offer and continue to maintain the interest of the developed countries and others to see our countries, our continent as a safe destination as it unlocks. Governments and businesses also need to create new mechanisms to help people whose jobs are at risk to find out how we operate on our labor demand and how we rapidly rebuild the skills for the new roles that are affecting us. Let me conclude now. I don't know how much time I have, but I'd rather save a little bit of time for the Q&A. So let me just conclude by talking about a little bit about where we stand with the International Labour Organization, who are urging African countries to adopt policy measures with unprecedented speed and scope. They highlight that we need to find the right balance of sequencing health, economic, social, and policy interventions. And I think that's a very, very important point to underscore. As a sense of urgency, as a matter of urgency, health is the priority. As a matter of urgency, the economic environment is a priority. As a matter of urgency, social intervention is an emergency. So it means that we have to find the right balance. It cannot be an either or. All of these have to be progressed. And it's a question of how we prioritize, how we leverage our resources. I did say that the three areas were partnership, leadership, and resources. So how we allocate our resources and how we build upon that to rebuild our societies. Implementing and sustaining policy interventions will also require a number of resources, and securing international solidarity and support is crucial for emerging and developing countries as a whole. So in conclusion, the policy responses which look at stimulus packages, our ability to focus on productive capabilities on the region, so that we can better address underlying vulnerabilities as and when they face us as a continent. With those few remarks, can I just thank the organizers for their timely intervention in putting together such a forum and in allowing for robust engagement and discussion about some of these complex issues that we do need to address, and how do we move forward when everything seems to be a priority as it is. Your views and your thoughts on this would also be highly appreciated. Thank you very much.
And now we are going to have our 10 minutes Q&A, and which our two guest speakers are going to answer. So we have one from our audience, and this is a question from Ikichuku from Germany, and asking, EU-Africa policy tends to be largely focused on migration. Africa has a large infrastructure gap and has slowed down the pace of economic growth. Besides China, there seems to be little willingness to fund infrastructural development in Africa. And I would start with Her Excellency, please. So I think the question is, how do we combine infrastructure coming from Africa or going to Africa?
If you don't mind, I noticed a number of questions on the live chat. I will just touch on them very briefly, because yes, I think please, they are pertinent before I address your question. One was talking about the GDPR, which is the Internet Data Protection. And I think rather than specifically on the GDPR, I would argue that for Africa, it is important that we enhance our data protection, especially as a way of boosting confidence in interconnectivity in the internet and in the fourth industrial revolution. So we need to unlock the power of ICT. And I believe data protection and related policies and regulations will help us in that area, because by doing so, we can open up the creatives, we can open up innovation, and we can open up the digital space more effectively. So it's not always about, are we connecting well with Europe and so on, but it's more about what is it doing for our own economy and our own environment. A second point, very quickly, was on the diaspora. When I mentioned partnerships, I must admit that diaspora are a crucial part of that partnership, because as we look at private sector, but diaspora can be very effective as part of that private sector, as part of the people who come back and who reinvest in the development of Africa, as sharing experiences and exposure from their opportunities and from their participation in other economies. So indeed, diasporas are very, very crucial as part of the partnership to rebuild the continent. There was a question that was asked about how we can support local production. And I would say that de-globalization is the order of the day, escalated by the current trade wars. We have found that producing at a local level is extremely important. And I have been encouraged to see that even though I flagged tourism, a lot of our economies have also promoted local tourism so that we get to know our own environments better. So maybe even as the continent, we can do more to travel and to get to know and experience the continent more. And so that's very important. And a very, very big portion of what has been flagged on the questions is the youth. How do we create sustainable youth development? And I think there are a couple of areas. First of all, youth empowerment. And Gerrit highlighted this as well in his presentation, that in other parts of the world, young people can very easily access revenue and support, financial support in certain areas. So in terms of our continent, there has to be a concerted effort to try to provide youth empowerment. And in some of our economies, there are very advanced and sophisticated youth development plans and youth financial mechanisms. So I would motivate for more of that, and for that to be a way to support our youth. But a second area is about youth engagement, because if we do the policies, if we make the arrangements and we treat youth as something that is acted upon, then I think we are losing an opportunity. Youth are very much part of the solution. They're very much part of the future, that we know for sure. And therefore, let's engage so that we can address the youth bulge and we can make sure that they are integral part of the system. And yes, corruption is a big challenge. I think there's corruption, there's inequality, and there is challenges to democracy, again, issues that have been flagged. And I think by engaging the youth, by ensuring our effectiveness and accountability as a people, we will then be able to address some of these challenges that are there. Specific to the question that you just asked about the EU, and I think I would defer that to Gerrit. What I do know in terms of partnership is that it is important that the priorities for the African continent be flagged, and that Africa should have a seat at the table at which they articulate the agenda, the narrative about what support and what assistance we need as a continent should also emanate. I think in the past, we found that conferences and ideas about how to help or resolve African issues was done without our voice being heard. And I think the only way we are going to kickstart or restart that relationship is to have a much stronger voice and a much stronger acknowledgement of what we need on the continent. Thank you.